Hello and welcome to this seminar organized by Sieps, the Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies, about the upcoming elections in France. My name is Annika Strömelin. I'm a journalist and I'm a member of the Sieps Advisory Council. And I've been entrusted the task to moderate this discussion about the presidential and the parliamentary elections in France and how the elections will affect Europe. It's today only 4 days until the first round of voting in the presidential election on Sunday. It's exciting and perhaps more uncertain than most of us thought just a couple of weeks ago. I'm therefore very happy to welcome our skilled and distinguished panelists who will help us to understand recent developments and put the upcoming French elections in a European perspective. I first say hello to Göran von Sydow, political scientist and director at Sieps. Hello, Göran.
Hello, Annika. Nice to see you.
How are you today?
Excellent, excellent.
Good.
Looking forward to this.
I'm also very happy to greet Elvire Fabry, and she is a senior research fellow at Jacques Delors Institute in Paris. Hello, Elvire.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. So how is the atmosphere in Paris a couple of days before the first round of voting on Sunday?
Well, it's a very surprising situation at the moment because we have the feeling that we've been through a very bleak campaign with very low engagement of the public opinions. And obviously, after 2 years of COVID pandemic, you have the feeling that the public opinion has been retrieving to private life and maybe not be engaging into collective mobilization as during a usual presidential campaign. And it's pretty surprising in the moment when we're facing so many crises, fighting for the recovery, the war on the continent. And what didn't help, obviously, for this campaign is that we have a president who engaged very lately with his candidacy in the campaign and who didn't want to oppose the other candidates until the first round. So people feel a little frustrated with that lack of confrontation. And what is particularly worrying at the moment is really and what we expect as a very important rate of abstention, which will be very problematic for this first round.
Yes. Thank you so much, Elvire. We'll come back to what you just said in a couple of minutes. But first, I'd like to say hello to Christian Lequen. Bonjour,
Good
Christian.
morning, Annika.
You are professor of political science at Sciences Po, also in Paris. So how are you today, 4 days before the first round of voting on Sunday?
Well, I'm fine, thank you, and I'm very happy to have this opportunity to exchange with Swedish friends. Well, in fact, as Elvire said, what is absolutely strange in the atmosphere is that nobody is really talking about this presidential election, which is strange for France, because it's a highly politicized country usually, and it's so quiet when you look at the news at the TV. Well, you have much more about Ukraine than about the presidential election. Of course, we are all worrying about the result because. We see that the far right is now growing again in the surveys. So for me, of course, it will not be good news to have the far right at the second round winning. So let's remain optimistic and hope that the European solution and not the nationalist solution will be taken by the French.
Thank you so much, Christian. Yes, and today's seminar will proceed as follows. After these first hellos, we will listen to some introductory remarks from our three panelists, and then we will have a joint discussion, and we will close the seminar 12:30 at the latest. And I will start to give the floor to Göran von Sydow. And Göran, you will give us an overview of how opinions in the presidential race are taking shape at the moment. Please, Göran, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Annika, and I'm so much looking forward also to discussing and listening to Elvire and Christian with their reflections. But let me start by giving this a little bit of background and setting the stage of where we are. So I wanted to give a little bit the background on where we are, and just to say the obvious that we are in a very important year for France. There's some key dates here. We know that France holds the rotating EU presidency already since 1st of January. So we focus a lot and we have high expectations of what this presidency can bring to Europe. Now, obviously, with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, conditions have been changed slightly. As mentioned, only 4 days from now, the first round of the presidential elections take place, with many candidates that will end up with 2 candidates only when we go in 2 weeks from then to the second round on 24th of April. A few weeks later, the new president's term will start. But it's also worth remembering that already in June, there will be parliamentary elections, also that are taking place in 2 rounds. And I mention that because it's also, although it's a very strong presidential system in France, it's also quite important to remember that there is indeed also the possibilities of different majorities in the case of one type of president and a different majority in parliament. Now, these are the latest polls, and I've used the slides I'm going to show are basically from the Economist collection of polls. And they show that indeed the incumbent President Macron is still in a lead ahead of Marine Le Pen of the far right, followed by radical right Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Then the newcomer Éric Zemmour at 10%, and then what is perhaps already worth mentioning now, the candidate of the traditional right, Valérie Pécresse, only now down at 9% of vote support, which is of course a very significant and low result for such an important party. The Green candidate, Yannick Jadot, at 5%, and even lower than, for being a traditional strong party, the Socialist Party's candidate, Anne Hidalgo. And what does this look like in comparison to how voting took place last time around in 2017? It's interesting because it's worth remembering that the last presidential election in France was indeed a quite substantial earthquake, in the sense that the traditional parties didn't go through to the second round, and instead the newly formed, the candidate that had formed his new movement, Emmanuel Macron, took many by surprise by winning the whole lot. And then you see these two, the difference here on the polling compared to the first round results in 17. And you can see that Emmanuel Macron is slightly ahead of what the votes he got in the first round, 17. Marine Le Pen, more or less on par with what she had that time. Jean-Luc Mélenchon slightly below. And then, of course, Éric Zemmour with this 10%, who didn't run in the race last time and is new to politics. But perhaps then it's worth mentioning already now that if you combine the vote share of Éric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen, you end up with almost a third of the French electorate voting for one of these candidates who belong to the far right. Then Valérie Pécresse is almost half down from what François Fillon got in the last elections, and then even worse for the Socialist Party's Hidalgo, who managed to underperform compared to what was extremely low result for the candidate last time around, Benoît Hamon. So this is a little bit to show where there is continuity and where there is also elements of something new in the way in which the candidates are structured and the voters. Now, let's look at a little bit at the evolution, the most recent evolution when it comes to the polls. And of course, it's difficult to track each one of these lines, but I would like to point out a few things. If you see at the top level, Emmanuel Macron has been the front runner all along, but when the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, you saw an increase in the support levels for Emmanuel Macron, just to slightly decrease in the last few weeks. You have seen development since, let's say, New Year's of a decline in the vote share for both Valérie Pécresse of the Republicans, but also for Éric Zemmour, particularly in the later period. On the other hand, there is an increase towards the end in the support for Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon. External observers may think that this is surprising because they have been slightly more understanding or supportive traditionally of Putin's Russia. But we can discuss this later on, why this takes place. But one interpretation could be that the closer you get to the election, the more voters also rally around those candidates that have a small potential of actually going through to the next round. So we imagine, for instance, there is an exchange in the votes that have been for Eric Zemmour, who have now been transferred into supporting Marine Le Pen. So this is where we are a bit in the development of public opinion. And I've basically mentioned most of these, that Macron is still the clear front runner, but it's worth remembering that it's a long time ago since an incumbent president in France got re-elected. So obviously there is a quite substantial cost of ruling, as we tend to think of. We have seen this rising support for Le Pen and Mélenchon in recent weeks. And worth noting again that the two traditional parties candidates, they are now, if you combine the share of support they have, they're only at 11%. I mean, this is quite something, right? How about Europe then? And I will turn a little bit to the figures when it comes to public opinion on Europe in France. But only at this stage is also worth remembering, if you look at, so you have a very pro-European president running on a very pro-European program. But if you put together the support levels of those candidates who are clearly Eurosceptic, you would see that they are almost at half of the total vote in currently. That is Le Pen, Mélenchon, and Zemmour at 48%, which resembles a little bit actually what it was like in 17 as well. Now, how about France and Europe then? This is a long period of looking at the Eurobarometer classic question, whether you think your country's membership in the EU is a good thing or a bad thing. We could always discuss the question and the sort of what you learn from this question. But it's what we can identify is that there is indeed a support level, which is relatively high for EU membership in France. It's lower than the average in the European Union, and actually lower also than a country like Sweden, quite substantially lower. You will note that there are quite few who think it's a bad thing, but about a third who have sort of mixed feelings about it, which is then, of course, a potential for mobilization. Another way of looking at how you think, what do you think about the EU? It's the degree to which you trust institutions or the EU as such. And this is from the most recent Eurobarometer, and it's the question whether you trust the EU. And you would note here that the country with the lowest trust in the EU in this particular poll is actually France, compared to the average, which is about half of respondents to tend to trust. You have only a third in this poll. The same goes for the institutions. So here the dotted blue line is the average in the European Union, whether you trust European Parliament, Commission, and Central Bank. And the gray line is the French results. Same here, a lower degree of trust. And particularly if you look at the last decade or so, you will see that France is sort of lower trust than many other member states. One thing which is interesting, I think, and I did some research on this myself, that the public opinion normally is more Eurosceptic in most member states than you actually vote for parties who have a Eurosceptic profile. This normally holds in most countries, but in France it has been the inverse. So while public opinion is at a certain level, people still tend to vote for candidates who are more Eurosceptic, which is something of a paradox compared to most other. But it's always worth remembering that voters don't only vote about Europe. So there are probably many, many other issues that are more important for the actual choice of party than only Europe. Now let's look then, what would we think about the second round? So as I've indicated, and as most polls would suggest currently, there will be a runoff between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen in the second round on April 24th. It has been relatively large margin so far in all polls, but now recently, the last few weeks and the last few days actually, this distance is shrinking, and it's now even within sort of margins of error, the difference between the support level for Macron and Le Pen. So it would be now at 52 on average, and 48 for Le Pen. And what's important then, if you look at the other figure on the other side of this slide, you will see that in the last elections in 2017, the two candidates stood against one another in the second round, and it was a quite clear victory for Emmanuel Macron, who managed to mobilize lots of voters who didn't vote for him in the first round in order to make that difference to 66 against 34 for Marine Le Pen. So you see that this gap is much, much closer now. And I will end now with just looking at a few issues that we can talk about and that I think are important in the future when we follow these elections. The first one is a reflection on sort of what kind of conflicts are the relevant ones in politics. And this argument goes that the traditional parties campaigning on left-right ideas, they have lost a lot of their role, I would say, and what looks like, let's put it this way, three camps. So you have far right and you have center and then you have far left, but they will have to go down to two camps to the second round. So there is an element of the new cleavage or a conflict that dominates in French politics, and that's more confirmed what we saw in 2017 now. I think it's going to be very important, the turnout and mobilization issues. How can the candidates get their voters out to mobilize them and motivate them? And that's also important, this third point here, how the defeated candidates in the first round will act and how they will tell their voters to act in the second round. So particularly on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, which was an important part of the victory for Macron in 2017, you will need it will be interesting to watch this. Fourth point, as I already mentioned, it's worth already now thinking about the potential of the parliamentary elections in June. And finally, and this is what I hope we can talk about there, this is going to have a massive and great importance for Europe and the European Union, this very outcome of the elections. And I'm so much looking forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Göran, for your very interesting contribution to this seminar. You showed several slides that showed us that there is quite a strong EU skepticism in France. And just if you have just one explanation for us to begin with, why is that so?
Well, I think probably our French speakers are more qualified than myself, but to answer that. But I think one should not underestimate the degree to which, let's say, elite people conflicts are also present, or sort of the ordinary people and how they perceive what could be a more of an elite project that is good for certain groups and categories in society that are in favor of European Union, and those who feel a little bit left behind. So short answer that I think has many more nuances to it.
Yes. Thank you so much, Göran. We'll come back to that question, of course. But now, Elvire, please, some introductory remarks from your side. You have the floor.
Thank you, Annika. Well, I think that Göran has very accurately described all the evolution of the campaign. And the first thing, when we sit back and we have a look at the past trends, we see that Emmanuel Macron was approaching this campaign in a quite comfortable position. While at the beginning of the COVID crisis, he's been criticized by the first initiatives that he took to handle the pandemic crisis. In the end, the way he managed the crisis was pretty well perceived, and the assessment and the management of the pandemic was positive. And as we saw in the slides, the start of the war in Ukraine has given him even an additional international posture, which was positive for his campaign. And he was confident that the French presidency of the EU would provide him with the possibility to make a full assessment of his engagement at the European level, which was a positive support for his campaign. But while doing so, he hasn't been engaging so much into a more let's say a more clear explanation of his domestic program for the country. And so he has left space for the other candidates to focus more on the domestic elements of his program. And what we see is that at the moment, this is happening at a moment when the fragmentation of the political landscape is still going on. It has started in 2017, but it is still going on. And in the end, with that lack of campaign and confrontation with candidates, people continue to have difficulties in perceiving what are really the main ideological divides between the different candidates, beyond what has been a very important issue and debate around migration issues for the past months, with rising candidates like the Eric Zemmour on the extreme right. There has been a lack of debate on economical and social and social elements, and so we see that this strong center piece of abstention is really it's really starting to be a very problematic issue, because we might expect to have a rate as high as 30% for the first round of the elections, and in response to that, what has been in 2002, when Jacques Chirac was confronted to Marine Le Pen, and then Emmanuel Macron in 2017 with what we call the Republican Wall, which was the mobilization of voters against the extreme right. We fear that at the moment this Republican Wall could be less responsive to a confrontation of Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, which is most probably will be the scenario. And at a moment when we see that the margin between the two candidates in the second round, as was mentioned by Goran, is really decreasing. It's decreasing with a margin of error of 1.5 or 2 points between the two candidates. And this is happening at a moment where Marine Le Pen has succeeded throughout the years to normalize her speech. She's not talking anymore about Brexit. This is out of her speech. But when you look at all the proposals, all her program concerning Europe, all the different measures are really going in counter of European treaties, and so it will have a huge impact for Europe. Beyond what is the impact for France, what we see that it's really a clear opposition, and it would be any risk of having Marine Le Pen winning the second round, because now we're really entering that sort of more worrying phase of the elections, and a sort of wake-up call in the campaign. It would be that she would really lead France to be a poisoning actor in France. Just to mention some of the proposals, she would call to restore the primacy of national law over European law. She would want to decrease the contribution of France to the European budget. She would want to restore some control at the national borders. So would mean no free movement or less free movement as much for goods as for people. I mean, all the measures are really in counter of the European project. So it would be a major earthquake if there was any risk to get closer to that sort of second round in favor of Marine Le Pen.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Elvire. That's really interesting. We shall discuss all these matters further on. But my first question before I leave the floor to Christian, I mean, we all understand that it's a difficult position for the president, Macron, to run a campaign. But as you said earlier, he ran it very late, and then he has refrained from any debate. Would you say that as a president of France, could he have run the campaign in another way?
Well, first, if he had engaged, there was not much surprise about the candidacy, obviously, but he was cautious. He was cautious in really avoiding to get trapped into the position of being the candidate of Europe, only of the candidate of Europe and globalization, and he knew that he would have to face the opposition as much as Marine Le Pen, Éric Zemmour, and even when you have a closer look at the program of Valérie Pécresse, the candidate of the Republicans, she's quite ambiguous on the not on the deep support of Europe, but on her proposals are not so clear on Europe, and in a way he left. The evolution of the French presidency and the announcements of conclusions and agreements on what he presented as a very ambitious program when he introduced his program for the French presidency in December. And so in a way, he left the events talked for himself, while he would have needed to really to engage more closely and to go to the voters, to face the voters. As we have at the moment a public opinion who continue to feel that he's far away from the public opinion, he's far away from the deep workers in France, and that they feel he doesn't understand really the situation, the difficult situation that people are feeling on the ground.
Thank you so much, Elvire, for giving us so much food for thought. And now, Christian, it's your turn to have some first remarks. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Annika. Well, my first remark is about, of course, this choice made by Macron not to campaign, right? It's strange because we are not accustomed to that. But on the other way, it's interesting to see that there is some legacy around that. This is this idea, that President of the Republic is the Gaullist idea. And it's interesting because Macron was elected to renew the politics in 2017, but you could see many elements of tradition in what he's doing, right? The idea that he's the providential man to a certain extent, and that he has to build a direct relationship with the people without campaigning, and no need of a political party, which is another thing. During the first term, well, he had the possibility to build a political party, and he did not do that. So he's absolutely convinced that politics is a question of direct relationships between the president and the people, and this is very traditional to a certain extent, and also very dangerous because the situation is not exactly the same than in the 60s, when de Gaulle was elected. So second element, turnouts. Yes, when you look at the result of the election in 2017, it's clear that Macron's electorate was center-right and center-left as well, right? So people who used to be, the social democrats inside the former or that socialist party. Well, those people now, there is a big question about what they are going to do. And this is very dangerous for the second round, because if the people who have a left-wing identity decided not to go, right, because they don't want Le Pen, of course, but neither Macron, then it's dangerous for Macron and very good for Madame Le Pen, because she's going to mobilize the electorate. So there is a huge responsibility in the hands of the left-wing voters about the second round of the election, if we are in a confrontation Macron versus Le Pen. On Europe, of course, Macron has a very ambitious program. Is not the only one, I have to say. If you look at the program of Mr. Jadot from the Greens or Madame Hidalgo, even. They support a development of European integration. What is interesting is the issues which are discussed about Europe. It's not new to have a debate about European issues in a French presidential election. No? If you go back to 1988, Mitterrand had this letter to the French where there was a whole chapter about Europe, the development of the European and Monetary Union, etc., etc. But now we do not speak really about this economic and social issue. We speak more about, security, what we call sometimes in French, l'Europe puissance, right? This is a bit new, but I can see an explanation in that. Macron is very much introducing this theme of Power Europe, right? Because he is again totally in the legacy of, a lot of political elites since the end of Gaullism, and I would say since Giscard d'Estaing in the 70s, who believed that, being Europeans is important to, save the French grandeur to a certain extent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the sort of instrumentalization of Europe to save the leadership of France. And it does not mean that he does not believe in grandeur anymore. Not at all, not at all. Macron believes in the grandeur of France. And again, an element. But the difference with de Gaulle is that now grandeur must go through Europe, right? And you have, and it's why this theme is important, because you have those who think, yes, with the competition of new powers in the world, India, China, etc. No way, it's the only solution. And you have those like Zemmour, Le Pen, who say, no. We have to keep the traditional model of independence, because this is the only way to be grand, to be great, right? It's the reason why we have this discussion about l'Europe puissance, which has been also a theme of the French presidency, right? When you take the slogan of the French presidency, one of the words is puissance, power. Ukraine. I don't know what we have to believe about the effect of Ukraine on the election. Well, we see that, and has been very well documented by Goran, that at the beginning of the crisis, clearly was good for Macron, okay, because of the pro-Russian feelings of some of his opponents for different reasons. Far right, Le Pen and Zemmour, they are just fascinated by the personality of Putin because, he's a leader, right? This is what they sought, right? He's a leader, the man who defends the national interest. For the far left, it was a bit different. It's not so much Putin than Russia, because Russia, they consider that it's a way to destroy what they hate, the international liberal order. So Russia has a balance vis-a-vis the United States. But finally, both could be considered as pro-Russian. And I don't know if it's still the case now, the effect in favor of Macron, because we see in the public debate that Macron is challenged about his dialogues with Putin. The far right now is coming with the argument, but you had so many telephone conversation with Putin, but what about the result? Nothing. We have also to learn about other experience, and what happened in Hungary is very interesting, right? Even if Fidesz, has always been more or less pro-Russian or pro-Putin. Well, it had no impact on the huge victory during the legislative or parliamentary election. So I know that every national context is different, but I'm not sure that Ukraine at the end will benefit so much to Macron. So I'm maybe stopping here. And yes, Euroscepticism, what has been said by Goran and Elvire is what I very much agree with that. And it's true that the political party is probably more Eurosceptic than the population. What is sure is that the population is not fan for leaving the EU. You never had a majority, and this is very different from the situation we saw in the UK, for instance. You can criticize the EU a lot, but leaving the EU, no. And this is why Madame Le Pen also has abandoned this slogan of Frexit, etc., because she knows that it does not work, especially with middle class. And she's focusing more and more on the votes of middle class.
Thank you so much, Christian. Thank you so much for deepening our understanding about the French politics. Really interesting. So let's now start a joint discussion about all this. And my first question goes to you, Christian, and I go back to the war. I mean, there's a brutal war in Europe. We have reports every day of atrocities. And from a Swedish perspective, it's a bit difficult to understand. I mean, even though you say Le Pen, Mélenchon, their support for Putin has been somewhat different, but still, how come these two candidates, as Göran showed us in his slides, is rising so fast in recent weeks, when we can see and hear all these awful things happen in Ukraine? How can I understand that, Christian?
Well, they are in a difficult situation because, of course, everybody is absolutely convinced that it's awful when you look at the images coming from Ukraine. Well, it's a terrible war. So they cannot go, Le Pen and Zemmour, against that, right? Because the images, the legitimacy of public diplomacy, etc., is in favor of Ukraine, but they trying to bypass, right? And now the discourse consists in saying, we don't want to be affected by the sanctions. We had to negotiate better with Monsieur Putin, blah, 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 which means at the end that they haven't give up their positions, right? But it's difficult for them to now to tell it very explicitly because of the atrocities, right? But I don't believe at all about a change of their loyalties. That's my point. And of course, this is extremely worrying. I do agree with that.
Elvire, what is your explanation to the fact that Marine Le Pen, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, two Putin fans, was supporters, even in different ways, that the support for those two candidates is rising now in recent weeks?
Well, that takes me back to the question of the impact of the war,
Yes.
precisely. Because on one side, we see that it has, in a way, blown some winds in Macron's sails, in all his strategy for strategic autonomy and giving credibility to what he's been fighting for during the past years, and a view of Europe as Christian just underlined, allowing to empower France and with the idea to build that sovereign Europe. But on the other side, you have with Marine Le Pen much more isolationist position, and precisely it has given the opportunity to Marine Le Pen to work as a sort of shield, protecting the French population, and all her speech is focused at saying this is not necessarily our war, and we shouldn't be engaging all the French economy in paying the costs for this war. So she's really betting on a discourse which is directed at protecting the power purchase of the French citizens. So on one side, you have a discourse with Emmanuel Macron focusing on empowering France, empowering Europe, and on the other side, it's a discourse focused at re-empowering France by isolating France and based much more on a sort of autarkic approach, and this is really heard by the French citizens when she proposes to support fossil fuels, and she's not supporting at all the diversification of supply in energy. She's supporting to have a strong state aid, really to protect the French population. So this, at the moment when people once again have gone through difficult years, we had the Gilets jaunes, we had the COVID, we had the war. This is really creating a strong divide between the two candidates. And additionally, what Macron is aiming at for the future years, it's really to propose more investment in long-term investment, be it for energy transition, in defense, for climate change fight. What precisely what Marine Le Pen is offering is short-term support. So it's more easily perceived by the public opinion. And maybe a third remark would be that at the moment when we see that there's a reality check with the need for closer cooperation on the transatlantic side, and with more cooperation within NATO and more supply of LNG coming from the US. This redynamization of transatlantic cooperation is also offering an opportunity for Marine Le Pen to insist on the need to build, to recover the full sovereignty of France and to be completely autonomous, while precisely Emmanuel Macron is more embodying as much the responsibility of globalization, and which has created more strategic dependencies in supply, and which is now recreating a stronger links with the United States, while herself is really offering an opportunity for recovering full sovereignty at the national level, and And of course, it reminds some basic arguments of Brexit. So once again, it doesn't have the look of Brexit, but it's really it really has the taste of it.
Wow, that's really interesting. Göran, when I listen to Elvire, I mean, when you look at the European level, the brutal war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion, my impression is that the positions of President Macron has been strengthened. I mean, his request for European sovereignty and autonomy. So, what is your take? How has the war in Ukraine affected French politics, European politics?
Well, I think to a large extent, I think you're right, that there is a kind of resonance on this agenda that Macron has pushed, precisely this one about limiting our dependencies, increasing the autonomy and the freedom of independent choices of Europe. And I think this kind of vulnerability that you find when being exposed to the kind of geopolitics that we are currently facing has indeed given stronger arguments and probably aligned some of the member states or actors who have been slightly critical of this ambition. But I also wanted to add something on this discussion about how the war in Ukraine plays out along the lines of Elvire and Christian. I saw this quite fascinating opinion poll this morning, which deals with it's from Ipsos and the Sieps in Paris. It deals with sort of the main preoccupations of voters. And it goes along two lines. So the first question is, what do you think are the main preoccupations or worries that we're facing in our society? And the other question deals with which of these questions will have an impact on your voting in these coming elections. And it's quite fascinating to see that indeed the war in Ukraine is the second most mentioned item when it comes to the preoccupation, sort of what's the important issue. But it's only the sixth most important item when it comes to will it affect your voting. So it means that you can be worried about something, but it doesn't necessarily translate into your electoral behavior. But at the very top of this list of different items, you find this one question, which is le pouvoir d'achat, the purchasing power in English, I think. So the question precisely that Marine Le Pen has been arguing about for such a long time. So my thinking about this is that, and it goes along with what you mentioned, that the war in Ukraine, there are different elements to it, because we also see how it increases fuel prices, it causes inflation, and those concerns that are effects of the war, but that also plays into the agenda favored by Marine Le Pen. And what has happened over the years also is that the confidence French voters have in Marine Le Pen to handle these issues are actually increasing. So she would be now at level with Emmanuel Macron. Sort of these are the candidates that French voters think are best in dealing with these issues. And I think Elvire has a very good point about this short-term versus long-term, because now we're in the middle of an election campaign and in the middle of a very serious crisis that has these different effects, and different candidates will get different answers that will appeal to voters in different ways. Just a final thing on this interesting poll I saw, the item which has the second from the bottom, the second least important, it's the European affairs, which is also interesting. So an item which President Macron is so much identified with and which had such a big role in the campaign 17 is now found, which is not very unusual. I mean, we know this from elections across Europe, that European issues tend not to be at the top level. But it's my at least hunch that once you get to the second round, if indeed we have Macron versus Le Pen, I still think these issues will matter quite a lot in the end.
Thank you, Göran. Yes, before we close this seminar, I would like you to look back and help us to understand how you would characterize the changes in France and in Europe with President Macron, and then look ahead and what we can envisage for the next 5 years to come. But before we do that, I'd like you to talk a bit more about the other candidates, because we've talked about Emmanuel Macron, Marine Le Pen, but I'd like you to, first, for example, Valérie Pécresse, when she was elected candidate for the Republicans for a couple of weeks, it seemed like she was quite successful. And now, what's happened, Christian, with her?
Well, she's in a very difficult situation for a substantial reason. There is a huge gap between what she thinks politics should be in this country. She's a centrist at the end, and she's not very anti-European. And the discourse she has to give to, the voters of her party and the militants also of her party, which are very, very conservative, right? So because of this gap between, what she really believes and what she has to deliver, there is a problem of credibility of Madame Pécresse. And it's true that it's a very difficult situation. Let's go back to the question of do we need Europe to survive in the future or not? Do we have to go to the autarkic in the autarkic way? Well, probably Pécresse is just in between the two, right? And she doesn't know how to deal with that. Sometimes she has to insist on the autarkic model. Sometimes she has to defend the model going through Europe. So it's a very difficult situation. And we don't have to forget that most of the center-right people of the former Pécresse party moved to Mr. Macron, right? And I would define Macron as a center-right candidate now in the political spectrum of this country. So she is very uncomfortable, and Macron destroyed les Républicains. Has he destroyed les Socialistes before?
Yeah, thank you. Because let's talk about the socialist candidate, Anne Hidalgo. Her campaign has almost collapsed. Elvire, if I could ask you, what's happened with the socialist candidate's campaign?
Well, yes, at the moment she would have a rate about it's between 1.5 and 2%. So the Socialist Party has completely disappeared in a way, and it's quite surprising, because when you see you look back at the 5 past years, you see that Emmanuel Macron, in the end, has been supporting and implementing political measures that were more leading to the center-right, and they are quite more liberal economic measures, and that it would have left some space for the Socialist Party to rebuild and to be in their position and to fight more actively during his presidency. And I would say that on first, there may have been a lack of rebuilding of a sort of clear ideology, center-left ideology within the party, and with the lack of leadership at the head of the Socialist Party. And then there's the problem of Anne Hidalgo, which is not embodying a leadership, and she's hardly heard during her campaign. And then in addition to that, there's a problem of fragmentation of the left, because you have on the left side, you have the Socialist Party candidates, but then you have you have Jadot for the Green Party, and then you have Mélenchon, Roussel representing the Communist Party, which has been doing a pretty active and successful campaign, because he was hardly unknown, and he himself hasn't been presenting some very new proposal. He's quite coherent with the tradition of the Communist Party, but he himself has been felt as a pleasant candidate. And but you still have that sort of fragmentation of the landscape on the leftist part, and which has hurt a lot the campaign of Anne Hidalgo. And finally, the big winner on the left is Mélenchon, with his very offensive program based on social and environmental priorities, which is breaking up with the traditional support of Europe integration, and which, with different lines, would be willing, as much as Marine Le Pen, really to shake up Europe from within.
Göran, what is your explanation to the very weak performance of the Socialist Party's candidate in this campaign?
Well, I agree with the sort of weaknesses within the party and the fragmentation and the competition on that spectrum of politics. It's also worth remembering that I mean, coming from a country like Sweden, where we have a traditional strong social democracy, well organized, and with a big sort of wide electorate, the French Socialist Party is a younger construction, and it's also already within this movement has always been a little bit more fragmented. But that also is there is something here about the institutional structure, let's say, of French politics, because on the one hand, you have this trend that we've seen across Europe of fragmentation, increasing fragmentation due to the fact we have different dimensions in politics, new issues that are channeled through new actors, while at the same time in the French system, due to the two rounds, you have the combination of fragmentation plus a two-party logic or a one-dimensional competition. To my understanding, at least, if you compare that with the proportional representation system, where you can sort of compete on different issues, and then you have to make compromises. It seems to me that, I don't know, it's a question more going back to our French speakers. I could say that the French voters, they are asking for a more proportional system. This is what they would like to see. But the fact that they are sort of within this institutional frame, that is also creating some of this distrust, perhaps, but also low levels of turnout, because you know that your votes will not count. And at the same time, these political leaders, I mean, they have apparently the incentives to be present in the first round, even though you know you stand no chance of going through to the second round. They are still higher than collaborating, joining forces on one candidate in order to go through to the second round. And this, to at least for a Swedish observer, is something that maybe one should think a little bit about in order to make French politics work slightly better, perhaps. But it's more a question, maybe, to Christian and Elvire.
Yes, Christian, what do you say about the interpretation from Göran of the French voters, what they really want?
Well, I am very convinced that many voters, would like to move towards more proportionality. It's the case because you have a problem of democracy, right? When you reach the level of parliamentary elections, because we have the same problem with parliamentary election. Well, you can have 21 or 22% like the far right in the surveys, and at the end get less than 5 deputies in the parliament, right? Which is something more and more questioned by the population. But I also observed that inside the camp of the president, some were very active in promoting more proportionality. And it was the case of Monsieur Bayrou in particular, who is one of the supports. He has another party, center-right, but he was not very successful. Macron resisted a lot, not to move too much towards proportionality. So there is a gap, I'm sure, between what the people in power consider as a form of control, the current system, and the expectation of the population on the other way to move towards a more democratic system. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. Elvire, there's another candidate I would like to discuss the performance of Eric Zemmour. I mean, he was a big surprise this fall, but now it seems like this fight on the extreme right side has been won by Marine Le Pen. So what's happened?
Well, what's happening is that Eric Zemmour has been really focusing on migration. I mean, that's the main pillar of his campaign. But while doing so, he hasn't himself even so much interest into social issues, into the concrete situation of the people, and that's really a space that Marine Le Pen has been able to fill, and if they are quite aligned on the migration issues, wanting to suspend any legal migration, even to expel some illegal migrants, all the issues that we well know. Marine Le Pen has been really occupying the space on the protection of power purchasing. And this is something which is now really weak for Zemmour. And in addition, as was mentioned previously, now in the framework of the war in Ukraine, we as Christian was underlying, we continue to see that Eric Zemmour is not adapting his speech to the current situation, and that he continues to have this sort of fascination for strong leadership, and even for the person of Putin himself. So he didn't find throughout the campaign, and now the evolution of the debate really focusing on power purchasing, he didn't find a way to renew his speech and to counter Marine Le Pen's arguments.
Can I say a word about Zemmour?
Absolutely. Please, Christian.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very much agree with Elvire, and it's true that most of this discourse is organized around the question of migration, and another issue, which is the Islamization of the society, right? Well, of course, you see the link between both, or I don't know what we say in English, Muslimization of the society. Of course, in his words, going against French secularism and the tradition of laïcité. So, but for the rest, what he's saying is very weak to a certain extent. We see that he's not really working beyond identity politics, you know. And what he's also doing is trying to occupy now a space where you can be very aggressive, where you can insult people, because Le Pen is not doing that anymore. You know, she's now a respectable politician. You know, as we said in French, fréquentable, right? In her own words. So this leaves him a space to attract the very extreme part of the anti-system voters.
Thank you, Christian. Very interesting. Now, let's look back a bit. Göran, if we look back, how would you characterize the way Emmanuel Macron has changed politics in Europe? How has his politics affected Europe?
Well, that's a very big and broad question. I try to maybe just a few points. I mean, the first one is that of ambition and placing Europe as a political entity and a project. And that was, I think, clearly spelled out in his so-called Sorbonne speech, which was very detailed, but it has sort of, it's the combination of a symbolic or a rhetoric at the one level, but also many concrete measures. And that rhetoric is based, as far as I understand at least, on an analysis on how the world is functioning and what the kind of changes, major changes that occurs in global affairs, and what kind of response then Europe should give to that. And his view is that we are entered into a different kind of territory of global competition that is a bit different from what we believed in the sort of the idea we had in the post-Cold War, that increasing trade exchange will generate sort of stronger standing for democracies across the globe, etc. And it's also in the context, you know, where you had, before his election, worth remembering, you had the election of Donald Trump as well as the Brexit referendum, and both of which had the response that we had to withdraw as nations in a simplified way. As far as I understand, Macron's program is that, no, we have to engage and we have to protect, but we have to do it at the European level. So it pushes things up to the European level. That's a little bit about the ideas. I think then there is the practice, the practicalities of it, and where I think Macron has been relatively, after all, successful. I mean, you can't change European Union from one country. You have to work together. But one is, of course, the Franco-German axis that was reinforced so much during his presidency, that you managed to find more agreements between France and Germany. And that, for instance, that materialized in the recovery fund, in the COVID pandemic response. The other one, which is perhaps a bit more difficult to precisely put a finger on, but I think there is a political leadership in various places in Europe that are a bit inspired or has like-mindedness with Emmanuel Macron. I mean, remember, he was very important in, for instance, in the appointments of the leading figures in the Commission, in the European Council, in the institutions, etc. So there is something of a convergence towards a centrist pro-European agenda that I think bears a lot of his mark. I'll stop there. There's plenty more to say, of course.
Thank you, Göran. Elvire, Christian, what is your interpretation of Macron's 5 years in power? Elvire.
Well, what surprises me at first sight is that we could have the impression that Emmanuel Macron has got a stronger footprint on the European agenda than on the French perception of European politics and position of France at the European level. That takes me back to some figures that Göran presented initially in the discussion. That sort of center, that sort of big block of ambivalent people in the French public opinion. 37%, if I remember well, didn't have such a positive image of the EU, or they have a trust. They trust more or less the EU. And when you look more carefully to those people, they have their support. They have quite a strong support of the image of of Europe, and they have strong expectations. The role of Europe in the world. They support common policies, be it energy, migration, the functioning of the currency, the free movements in the single market, but they have strong expectation, and in a way they feel quite frustrated that the EU is not moving on quicker. And when you see precisely what Emmanuel Macron has been defending through the 5 years, which was, as Göran just said, a very ambitious program, very concrete program, and very covering all the issues, providing some coherence really to where do we stand and where we want Europe to go, and where do we want Europe to be faced to the big powers, and building all his strategy on the discourse of autonomy, strategic autonomy. the surprising thing is that it didn't have such an impact on the French public opinion. Just after his election, there was a rise of confidence in the EU in the polls, but then it went decreasing again. And while there was, if we compare it to the previous presidency of François Hollande, during his presidency, we could feel that France wasn't so much active in Brussels, and that while François Hollande was feeling and arguing that he had he was continuing in coherence with the legacy of Jacques Delors, social democrat approach, he wasn't so active on the European agenda. And precisely, Emmanuel Macron has been offering to the French public opinion a strong engagement at the European level. So this is a surprising element. And one thing that is very interesting in the way Macron defended his proposals at the European level, it's that he has been able precisely to offer an alternative to what was considered the naive Europe, which was an image of Europe, which was also sticking to his image, the European, the globalist, engaging in free markets, free trade, and precisely he's been little by little pushing at the European level some proposals, allowing to have to develop a more protective Europe, but not a closed Europe, but a Europe which protects more in order to engage precisely on the international stage and to be competitive and to face Chinese trade distortions and precisely all the proposals that were put on the table concerning the autonomous trade defense tools, which now are reaching agreements, notably for public procurement with reciprocity, control over foreign subsidies. All those measures, little by little, should have an impact, little by little, on the French public opinion. And a final element, going back to what Corinne was saying, is that I think that he has been able to develop a much more collective approach of negotiation at the European level. Of course, he sticks to that sort of Gaullist approach of with a rational objective of where he wants Europe to go in the next years. But when we see when Xi Jinping was coming to Paris and he invited not only the president of the European Commission, but also Angela Merkel to come to Paris, and when he went to Beijing, inviting as well German counterparts, those new initiatives are quite new from the French political side.
Yeah. Thank you, Hervé. Christian, what is your view on Macron's performance on the European stage?
Well, maybe it's an effect of working on French EU policy for more than 30 years now, but I see in his program much more continuity than change. Well, he's very much in the line of the French pro-EU people, and let me explain that. First of all, you need Europe to cope with the rest of the world, and for that you need both hard and soft power. Second, you need, of course, a market, but with protection. So you have to resist to any neoliberal idea of what the market is. Third, you do not need to enlarge too much. He's not a great fan of enlargement, not at all, and you will not find in his statements any support for enlargement, and finally you need a Franco-German leadership. So when you have said that, you see that it's probably not very different from what some of his prestigious predecessors said about what Europe should be, right, for France. Now, I think there's a lot of elements of continuity and strategic autonomy. My impression is that there is a slight change in Paris. You will not see Macron using so much now this notion, especially in the domain of defense, because we have understood in Paris that it could be acceptable only if it's not considered incompatible with transatlantic relations, right? And of course, when Trump was at power, it was much easier for Macron to say, maybe we need to have an autonomous defense because we don't know what the Americans will do, etc. But with the election of Biden and after that Ukraine, it's much more difficult, I would say, even impossible to defend such a position. So there is a clear understanding in Paris, it's my impression, around Macron, that the question of the compatibility between European strategic autonomy and transatlantic relation is absolutely crucial.
Can I add something?
Before we close this seminar, I would like you to look ahead. And please, Elvie, perhaps you can squeeze in your answer to what you are about to say in this framework. So, because if we look ahead on politics in France and in Europe, and what kind of requests for change we can expect from France during the coming 5 years. I mean, of course, that's difficult. We don't know yet who will be president. But still, Göran, if you look at the European level, would you say that Christian is saying this is continuity? Would that mean that we also would expect more of the same sort of more strengthened European defense, strengthened European autonomy, perhaps a new request for a new recovery fund? Who knows? Göran, tell us what you are expecting.
Well, yes, thank you so much. And I also want to take this moment to thank the other panelists for all these brilliant comments. I do also agree with Christian about the continuity aspect. Just to add a little maybe on the agenda, because the agenda has also changed. For instance, the green issues and the innovation. There are certain themes that perhaps are slightly new from France to push at the European level in connection with the agenda. But yes, indeed, if considering we think that there's a second period for Emmanuel Macron, then there's going to be continuity. But there's also a little bit, after all, despite this continuity, I think the expectations are also a bit raised. You place the bar a little bit higher. So one example, for instance, where France has pushed is this so-called Conference on the Future of Europe. Now, maybe France and Macron had a specific idea what kind of problems should be solved through this conference. But when you start a process like that, you also raise expectations from other actors that are beyond the control of one particular country or that particular person who has pushed the agenda. So in the case we, for instance, look in the future, there will be a discussion about treaty changes, etc., reforming the European Union. Obviously, France and a re-elected Macron will put lots of ambitious issues on there. Will it be successful in precisely that way? Well, I don't think so. I think there's going to be many actors who have also will have their stakes in this respect. And just one final thing on sort of looking a little bit ahead. Even in the case if Emmanuel is re-elected, we know that there is to begin with the parliamentary elections in June. Last time around, I was even more surprised by the victory of En Marche in the parliamentary elections, a newly formed party. This time around, looking at how his movement has done in regional elections, etc., during this period, I'm not that convinced. So maybe we will also face a period with a different majority in the French parliament, which also will make it a different second period for Emmanuel Macron. He cannot then run it as his own show as he has done so far. And finally, I also think, even in the case Macron has a victory, there are, of course, these tensions within French politics that I don't think will go away just because of that. So I think there's going to be political uncertainty and reconfigurations among many actors once these elections are over. And I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Göran. And Elvire, excuse me, I interrupted you before. So please, now the floor is yours.
No, well, it's complementary with your question. Yes, if we talk about defense and security issues, Emmanuel Macron has been taming the theme of strategic autonomy as perceived as an opposition with NATO or not, and now he concretely engaged in developing French and European capabilities within NATO. But I think that his position on strategic autonomy in the economic field remains very, very engaged, and that will be really the core of his second mandate if he gets this second mandate. And he's satisfied but quite cautious with the sort of new dynamism at the European level given to that discourse about strategic autonomy and to all the investments that would be needed to develop more energy sovereignty, food sovereignty, as he has used now to use the term for all the different policies. But it will mean very long-term engagement. It will. I mean, all his program during a second mandate will be really focused at this question. And as Göran just said, I think that we can already anticipate that during the parliamentary elections, he will really have a much reduced, if not majority, even could be in a difficult position, and that he will be facing most probably during the next years some domestic turbulences that might limit his capacity to push forward on the European agenda.
Yeah. Wow, you know what? Time is soon 12:30. I mean, I could go on discussing with you for many hours. It's been so interesting. But Christian, I will, if you have some final comment, I will give the floor to you before we close the seminar. Please, Christian.
So just to say that I agree that the next mandate, if he is re-elected, Emmanuel Macron, will be very much focused on economy, but also technology, because when you look at the people who are around him and the people who are very close, you have two kinds of people. The first part is very classic in French politics, is higher civil service, right? But the second, and this is the novelty, are all these digital startuppers, people who are creating this startup, etc. And this is his world to a certain extent. So it's also a generational thing, but it has a risk also, because sometimes those people who are very modern in the sense of speaking about digital economy, etc. They are assessed by the ordinary citizens as not representing the society as a whole. You know what I mean? and this is a problem for Macron. He's still a bit in discrepancy with the ordinary citizens, and he never filled the gap. It's a difficulty. It's a structural difficulty for him.
Thank you so much, Christian Lequen. Thank you, Elvie Fabry. Thank you, Göran von Sydow, for very interesting contributions to this seminar. I feel wiser. Thank you for being here, and thank you for watching. And goodbye for today.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Merci.